Hey guys, I'm coming at you from a slightly different location today, but our topic is still a good one. As always, please make sure you are filling out your notes organizer as you watch this video. Today's video topic is Kingdom Animalia. We're going to be looking at the characteristics of what makes an animal. Why would an organism belong to this kingdom? We're going to look at some of the body plans and anatomical features of animals as we look at the most simple to the most complex. And then we're going to look at how we use that information to classify animals. So let's start by just talking about what makes an animal. Why does an organism belong to the kingdom Animalia? As you remember, kingdom Animalia belongs to the domain Eukarya. So all animals are eukaryotic. Their cells have a nucleus and they have membrane-bound organelles. All animals are multicellular, which means they're made up of many cells. All animals are heterotrophic, which means they have to consume other organisms in order to obtain their energy. And most animals do reproduce sexually, but a few reproduce asexually and a few reproduce in both ways. And then all animals are able to move, and I'm going to put a little star next to that statement because for a few animals, that's just like during their larval stage of their life cycle, but all animals are able to move at some point in their life cycle. So let's refresh our memories on some animal cell structures. Remember, animal cells do not have an outer cell wall. The outer cell covering is just a cell membrane. Every animal, except for sponges, cells are organized into tissues, and then for the majority of your animals, they go into more complex systems. So tissues form into organs, and organs form into organ systems, and those organ systems work together in our more complex animals to form the entire organism. But depending on the animal, and depending on what the cell is being used for, different animal cell structures have specialized features to them for feeding, for digestion, for protection, that sort of thing. Now, you probably have heard that animals can be sort of grouped into two major categories, invertebrates and vertebrates. The majority of your animals, 90 to 99% of animals, remember we don't know all the animals that exist in the world, but most of the animals are what we call invertebrates. Those are animals that do not have a backbone. The majority of invertebrates do have what we call exoskeletons, or sort of skeletons on the outside of their body, except for echinoderms, those have endoskeletons. But for the invertebrates that have exoskeletons, those are outer coverings which serve as some sort of support framework. They provide protection, they prevent water loss, but the thing about exoskeletons is they don't grow with the animal, so they have to be shed as the animal grows. Your other major category of animals are vertebrates, which is much fewer in number. You can see on this slide here. Here would be your mammals and other vertebrates, so very small in numbers compared to our invertebrates. Those do have a backbone, and they contain what we call endoskeletons, or skeletons on the inside. And this is an internal framework that grows with the animal, so we obviously don't have to shed our skeleton as we grow. It grows with us. Now, what the skeleton is made up of can vary from cartilage, like in sharks and in stingrays, to bone, like is in us. Okay, so here this would be examples of invertebrates, and these would be examples of vertebrates with endoskeletons. Now, animals we know can be found all over the earth. Anywhere there is capable of life being supported, you're going to find animals there. So everything from marine waters, from coral reefs to the benthic zone, to fresh water from rivers and streams to lakes and ponds, to land, right? Our terrestrial ecosystems, from deserts to grasslands to rainforests to polar ice caps. You're going to find animals in all of those places. Now, remember we talked quickly about reproduction, and I said I have to put a little star next to that. Most animals do reproduce sexually, utilizing either internal fertilization or external fertilization. Internal fertilization is when the sperm and the egg join as a zygote, the fertilized egg, inside the animal's body. External fertilization, and you're going to hear me use these terms a lot, so it's important that you understand what they mean. External fertilization is like what's happening in this picture here, where the female releases the eggs into water, and then the male would release the sperm into the water as well. So the sperm and the egg form the zygote outside of the body. Now, this is going to only happen in animals that either live in the water or they're going to lay their eggs specifically in the water, but it does require some sort of aquatic environment. And then for the organisms, for the animals that reproduce asexually, some animals actually are what we call hermaphrodites, meaning they're capable of producing both egg and sperm. An earthworm would be an example of that. Our other forms of asexual reproduction in animals, you have animals that are capable of budding, like a sponge or coral, fragmentation, which would be like a starfish, breaking off and then regenerating. That's asexual representation asexual reproduction as well. So an animal that is capable of producing a new animal from the same one single parent. Okay, now let's get into a little bit of animal development details. So the fertilized eggs of most animals, the zygotes of most animals, follow a similar pattern of development. So first of all, we have our zygote, which is our fertilized egg, and it starts to undergo mitosis. So one cell becomes 2 cells, and 2 cells becomes 4 cells, and so on and so on. And so we have the formation of an embryo, which is that little ball of cells, from 2 cells until you have a ball of cells. Then the embryo, that little cluster of cells, is going to form what we call a blastula. And basically, this is where the ball of cells fills with fluid and becomes almost like a hollow bubble of cells on the outside, fluid in the inside. That's the blastula stage, so like this picture right here. Then, in all animals, the blastula is going to start to pinch in, and that's going to form what we call a gastrula. And that sort of like, it's going to form like a double bubble, right? A bubble within the bubble. And that's going to be really important as you get into your more complex animals, what happens after that stage. But all animals sort of follow this similar sequence of events. So the zygote, then the embryo, then the blastula, and then the gastrula. Now the gastrula is going to develop into different tissue layers. So the inner cell layer is going to form what we call the endoderm. And in most animals, that's going to form the digestive organs and the digestive tract lining. And then the mesoderm, which is your sort of like more complex layer that not all animal gastrulas are going to form. This is going to form more complex organ systems and like different muscle tissues. So not all animals have that mesoderm layer. And then the ectoderm layer is the outer cell layer, which is going to develop into nervous tissue and the skin of the animal. Okay, this is a really important diagram and something that is really important to understand, so make sure you fill this in on your notes organizer. Animals are classified by how their tissues develop, which we just briefly talked about and we'll talk about more in detail, their body symmetry, their body plan, their body cavities, how they digest food, and their different anatomical features. So go ahead and take a minute to pause on this slide and fill in this chart on your notes organizer. So let's talk, you're going to hear me talk a lot about animal symmetry as you learn about these different animal groups. So it's important to understand why we're looking at symmetry and what type of organisms you would see each of these types of symmetry. The type of symmetry an animal has really allows it to move in certain ways. So symmetry, when I say that, I'm just talking about the similarity or balance among body structures of an organism. So animals can be asymmetrical, they can have radial symmetry, or they can have bilateral symmetry. Asymmetry means that their body cannot be divided evenly across a central plane or an axis in any way. It's never going to sort of fold in half and be equal on both sides. So examples of animals that have asymmetry would be like sponges and coral. So here's a sponge, here's coral. This doesn't allow for movement, right? These are more sessile or non-moving animals. Remember, they can move during their larval stage, but at this point in their life cycle, they don't have any body symmetry, which means that they sort of have to plant themselves in place. Radial symmetry is when an animal's body can be divided along any plane through a central axis into roughly equal halves. So think about animals with radial symmetry, their body sort of radiates from a central point, right? So that would be like a jellyfish or a starfish or an anemone. Animals with radial symmetry. This typically allows for very slow movement, very simple animals that don't need to sort of hunt for prey specifically. They just need to be able to detect and capture prey in any direction at any time. This type of animal only develops from ectoderm and endoderm. They don't have that more advanced mesoderm. And then there are some anatomical terms that are going to come along with organisms that have radial symmetry. So if you hear me refer to the oral surface, I'm talking about the surface of the animal that has the mouth. So on a starfish, that's the underside, right? It's always going to be the underside of an animal with radial symmetry. Or the aboral surface, which is the side opposite the mouth. So the sort of side you would see on a starfish if you were looking down in the water. Okay, then we have animals that have bilateral symmetry, and this is the sort of most complex form of symmetry. You're going to see this in more complex animals. So bilateral symmetry is when the body can be divided into mirror image halves along one plane through the central axis. So examples are worms, insects, crustaceans, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, humans, right? We have bilateral symmetry. You could sort of cut us down the middle and we'd be roughly the same on either half. This is going to be seen in your more advanced animals because this is an adaptation for movement in a specific direction. This is an adaptation for animals that are what we call hunters, right? They want to find their prey and be able to move easily in that direction. So animals that have bilateral symmetry, they've developed from all three of the tissue layers, ectoderm, endoderm, and that more complicated mesoderm layer as well. Animals that have bilateral symmetry exhibit what we call cephalization, which means they sort of have a thinking end, a head end with some sort of concentrated nervous tissue, either like a brain-like, what we call ganglion, or an actual brain, but they have cephalization, a head region. So this is going to require us to use some different anatomical terms as well. So for an animal with bilateral symmetry, if I'm talking about their anterior end, I'm referencing their head end. The opposite end would be their posterior end. So you can see on all these diagrams here, anterior and posterior. And that looks a little bit differently for organisms that are like tetrapods, sort of walking like this, versus animals that are more upright like we are. Okay, then the dorsal surface would be the back surface of the animal with bilateral symmetry. Think of the dorsal fin being the scary fin, the fin you don't want to see in the water, right? So their back fin. And then the ventral surface would be the side opposite that, which is the belly surface. And then again, with animals with bilateral symmetry, their body cavities can vary in different ways. They can have a more simple sort of sac-like body cavity that has a single opening, so food and waste are going through the same spot, or they can have a more complex tube-like body cavity with two openings. This is where, food comes in one end, the mouth, and then waste goes out the other, the anus. You're going to have a more complete digestive system, which means they're going to be able to obtain nutrients more efficiently and effectively. So we give those some terms. If an animal has a solid body without a fluid-filled gut, we call it an acoelomate. These animals, like flatworms, for example, this picture here, are going to rely on just simple diffusion in order to move gases and nutrients throughout their body. Pseudocoelomates, and those are going to be like your roundworms, are going to have a fluid-filled gut, but it's only going to be partially lined with mesoderm, meaning they're not going to have like internal organs also lined with the mesoderm tissue layers. And then true coelomates, which is basically going to be everything after mollusks and segmented worms, they're going to have a true fluid-filled gut that is lined with mesoderm and also encloses all the organs with mesoderm as well. This was a key adaptation for more specialized structures, more specialized systems within the animal. And then to further classify coelomates, their embryonic development can develop in two ways. They can have protostome development, which is where the mouth develops from that first opening in the gastrula. So if a mouth develops here, that we're going to say that animal has protostome development. So that's going to be like snails, earthworms, spiders, things like that, more simple animals. And then if they have deuterostome development, it's actually the anus that develops from that first opening in the gastrula. And this is going to be your more complex animals, like mammals and birds, but also the echinoderm group in invertebrates, which is why, going back to this cladogram right here that I showed you earlier, we think that echinoderms are more closely related to vertebrates, mammals, humans, than any other invertebrate because their development is more similar and they share more similar characteristics. Okay, so what I want you to do right now is I want you to attempt to answer these questions using the chart that is on this slide. So which invertebrate animal group is an acoelomate? What are the characteristics of a mollusk? Chordates or vertebrates are most closely related to which invertebrate animal group, which is the answer I just gave you. Which invertebrate animal group are the only animals without true tissues? And what do annelids and arthropods have in common? See if you can answer those questions. And that's all I have for you today. Hope you have a great day. Bye.